soggiorno veneziano del ministro della propaganda del Reich. Il popolo raccolto in piazza San Marco, straordinariamente illuminata, improvvisa una vibrante manifestazione al rappresentante della nazione amica, affacciato con Sua Eccellenza Alfieri al balcone centrale del Palazzo Reale. Dopo il saluto al duce, scandito in perfetto italiano, Sua Eccellenza Goebbels, accompagnato dal ministro Alfieri, è sceso in piazza intrattenendosi fra l'elegantissima folla cosmopolita che occupava i tavolini dell'antico caffè Florian, ad ammirare l'incomparabile spettacolo di questa illuminazione veneziana. Un giorno dopo i pescatori di Chioggia, con i loro bragozzi d'alto mare, bragozzetti leggeri, battelli a pizzo, bragagne e imbarcazioni da diporto costituenti una flotta di 411 unità, offrivano un nuovo spettacolo di grande suggestività marinara agli ospiti germanici, imbarcati con il ministro della cultura popolare e poche altre personalità sul panfilo misurata del Conte Volpi.
but you can certainly say that oligarchism and usury, geopolitics, monetarism, so forth, everything that goes with it, Aristotelian philosophy, empiricism. Oligarchism is the cancer of humanity. And how does it behave? Well, it behaves in the way that cancers do, in the sense that it moves its location. It shifts its locus and its center of gravity. And that's this question of metastasis. And what I would like to propose is that we look at the historical period we're trying to fathom here, the 2,500 years, as far as the oligarchical side is concerned. And again, I can't give the history of the other side within this framework because it leads in different directions, although the points of conflict are clear enough. The basic idea that I would like to illustrate is the idea of a triple metastasis, for want of a better word. Metastasis that takes place 3 times in very schematic terms, and it brings this principle of Diocletian from the Roman Byzantine period all the way up through Venice, British Empire, and the United Nations. So we get, first of all, the oligarchical forms that were known in the ancient world, in particular these Babylonian magi, the cult of Apollo at Delphi, we can talk about this, the Roman Empire itself, and the continuation of the Roman Empire, this sort of 1,000-year rotting corpse of the Byzantine Empire, right, which was so interesting for people like Gibbon. Main idea is all of that in terms of outlook, in terms of families, fondi, but above all, again, it's the philosophy that counts, then found its way into Venice through things that through processes that we've tried to study. That was then shifted into the British Empire over a period of centuries, and over, in particular, the last 100 years or so, this oligarchical principle has come to make its home more and more in these organisms of self-government, of world government, one world rule, and so forth. Now, if you look at this in the broadest possible terms, you will see that this does give you a way of making sense out of these long periods. But again, it's got to be done in the broadest possible terms. For example, when you're looking at the metastasis of the center of world oligarchism from Venice to the British Empire, you've got to include in that things like the Protestant Reformation, the Aristotelian Counter-Reformation. You've got to include the wars of religion, in particular the 30 Years' War, the creation of the Venetian party in the Netherlands, in Scotland, in England, and so on. And we can look at this maybe in some of the coming sessions. I don't think we're going to get quite that far tonight. When we look also at the metastasis from Venice to the British Empire, we have to remember that this reaches all the way, really, just about to the end of the 1700s, to the end of the 18th century. And that's where you get these characters, Casanova, Cagliostro, and, of course, the inimitable Gian Maria Ortez, but also this Antonio Conti that we have to talk about, the great Newtonian anti-Leibniz operative of this particular salon, right, the Conversazione in Venice in the 1700s. Now look, we have this cancer metaphor. It's a good one. On the other hand, it probably doesn't exhaust all the ways that you want to think about this kind of metastasis, because when you're looking at this stuff, it, for example, means that the predominant center of imperialism and oligarchism surely passed from Venice to the British Empire sometime in the 1700s. You could say it happened in 1763, or it happened at some other date, right, some other point in the course of the century. Indubitably, it did happen. Indubitably, the main fondi were transferred from the Procurazie in Venice to the Bank of England through various flight capital channels, the Great Bank of Amsterdam, and so forth. And ultimately, the main center of this stuff did get to be in the British Isles. But that doesn't mean that the earlier center is simply shut down. That would really be a tremendous mistake. And even the British had the fleet and they had the geopolitics. And even into our own century, the espionage, intrigue, and epistemological warfare coming out of Venice is really as important and very often more important than what's coming out of the British Isles themselves. And certainly that's the, I think you'll see that when we get to people like Casanova, Cagliostro, Conti, and Ortez, that without the contribution of the Venetians in this area of secret intelligence operations, where they really were supreme, they were really much more accomplished than the relatively primitive British beginners here of the Secret Intelligence Service, right? The copycats of Shelburne and so forth. That without Venice still being an operative center in the 1700s, the British never could have defeated France and never could have set up their worldwide empire. So, again, metastasis as a cancer metaphor is a good one, but we shouldn't try to follow it too closely, because you're talking about a growth that moves, but the previous center keeps going. And of course, you also have these other tricky ones here where, as for example, in Venice, vis-a-vis the Byzantine Empire, at a certain point, Venice turns around and conquers the Byzantine Empire, which makes it all rather complicated. In other words, it's not simple. Well, let's try tonight to build up to an understanding of Diocletian and his so-called reforms, and why these were bad, and why you don't want to try them again. You don't want to go down that road another time, and where all of this stuff came from. And I suppose where we ought to start is the cult of Apollo at Delphi, as you could call it an organ of world government. As a matter of fact, the more you look into it, the more it does appear as functioning in many ways similar to the United Nations Security Council and the General Assembly of our own time. Yeah, you do. And some of these personalities also seem to come back. We'll get after Boutros a little bit later on. The Delphic Apollo, there were probably half a dozen different oracles that the Greek world knew. But this was the dominant one. And it had this funny position of being in the center of the Greek world in terms of geographical location. Actually, if there's a map, is there a map around here? Is there? Would it be possible to get a map of the Mediterranean world or something like that? Thank you. The legend is that Zeus wanted to find... Sure. The legend is that Zeus wanted to find the center of the world, so he released an eagle from each extremity of the universe, and these flew on a line and met, and that was Delphi. So it's this rocky, craggy place where this strange temple is located. Now, the Apollo that is worshipped there is, of course, the oligarchical deity par excellence. And many things flow together into the shape of Apollo. In many ways, Apollo is Marduk. Marduk being this sinister oligarchical god of the interior of Asia Minor, of Turkey. But then, of course, there's also in Apollo this overtone of Isis and Osiris, and that Apollo with this Pythoness, right, this woman, the Pythia, we'll see who she is, reminds you somewhat of Isis and Osiris, and of course the fact that Osiris was castrated, big important aspect in the whole thing, and then brought back from the dead by Isis. The way that the temple was set up was that you had this priestess, the Pythia, the Pythoness, who was, whether she was young, as she was at certain points by tradition, or sometimes only older women were allowed to do this function, she would start off by being a relatively illiterate country woman who knew really very little of what she was doing. But she would mount a seat which was placed on a tripod over a kind of cleft in the ground. It was something obviously you wouldn't want to fall into. But she would sit on this thing, and after having eaten certain kinds of ceremonial foods, burned barley corns and other kind of stuff, she would begin to babble. And she would just babble. And she would go into transports of Apollonian ecstasy, whatever, and just talk, right? Speaking in tongues, I guess, if you've heard any of that stuff going on. Now, how did anybody make sense out of this? Well, there was a priesthood that was attached to the temple of Apollo. And these were the oligarchical families of Delphi, which was a small state. It was a city-state, I guess, to some extent. But small, not populous, not powerful, not anything special in itself. But somehow these people represented a cross-section of Greek oligarchical opinion, and more important, were connected to these Babylonian magi and the people who were operative in the Persian Empire to the east. So the way it would work then is that you would come as a representative of Athens or of Corinth or whatever you were. You would bring gifts, put down money, and you were then allowed to question the Pythoness, who would then go into one of these transports, and she'd rattle off a whole bunch of babbling, and then the priests would come up, and they would explain what it was that she had said, which had, of course, to come out in Greek hexameters of a certain literary quality. Now, that makes these guys the original spin doctors. They put the spin. Something happened, and they told you what it was, right? What did all that mean? And in Greek hexameters. Now, the prestige of this oracle was immense. It was obviously a bank. There were these deposits of treasure, gifts that were made. The wealth of this place was a legend in antiquity. And it was also, therefore, a treasury. It looks like various cities actually kept part of their funds there as a kind of a central bank for the Greek states. Obviously with the priests, with cults, and then, of course, the fact that since everybody came there on these missions, the priests learned the knack of pumping everybody for information. So, as many authors say, this was the biggest intelligence bureau in the world. They would sometimes formulate answers. For example, there was one guy, he said, look, should I invade my neighboring country? And the answer was, if you carry out the invasion, you will destroy a great kingdom. Of course, it turned out that it was his own kingdom that was destroyed. This was King Croesus. But there are, I think, important tendencies in the way that the Delphic oracle operated that are worth pointing out. The main thing is that it was an organ of the oligarchy, and that this can be proven by the political choices that it made. I mean, it made these things repeatedly. First of all, the main favoritism of the Delphic oracle was for Sparta. And why is this important? Well, as Schiller pointed out in that famous lecture on history, the principal tendencies that combat in Western civilization are the tendency of Lycurgus of Sparta, the oligarchical, imperialist, militaristic one, and Solon of Athens, the city builder, on the other side. Well, it is legendary that Lycurgus's constitution of Sparta was either dictated, as I think is likely, dictated by the priests of Apollo at Delphi, or at least approved by them. In other words, Lycurgus brought it to the oracle and saying, don't you think that the Lacedaemonians ought to be governed by these laws? And then, of course, the Pythoness went, and the priest said, yes, you win, Lycurgus. So that is the version that we find in Xenophon, that Lycurgus went to the oracle and got the version, the constitution for Sparta approved. Thank you, Joey. We're just going through some stuff on the Delphic oracle. Great, over there, yeah, over there would be fine, but not on the, yeah, good. Thank you. Now, you can also see in cases of war, the Delphic oracle would sometimes declare that it was supporting one side or the other. For example, in the case of the Peloponnesian War, a little bit before 400, right, this general war of the Greek states, the Delphic Apollo made an unsolicited declaration that they were supporting Sparta. Not only were they supporting Sparta, but they were not going to wait to be asked. They were going to support them and go down the line with them no matter what they did, which is rather revealing, I guess you'd say. Now, the other way that the Delphic Apollo expressed its pro-oligarchical tendencies is its support for the Persian Empire, because, of course, Greek history in this time is this endless war, century upon century, of trying to stand up against the constant encroachment of the Persian Empire, which they basically succeeded in holding off and ultimately conquered, even though the Greeks by that time were weakened themselves. It is the attack of the Persian Emperor Xerxes, which concerns us here. This is reported in Thucydides. The Athenians sent a delegation of 2 representatives to the Delphic Apollo, basically saying, well, Xerxes is attacking us. He's approaching. What should we do? And this is a remarkable opinion that was then tendered by the Delphic Apollo. The Delphic Apollo basically said, you wretched men, what are you sitting here for? Fly to the ends of the earth and leave your homes in the topmost heights of your wheel-shaped city. The fire and fierce Ares driving his Syrian car will destroy your city, and he will lay low many other fenced cities and not yours alone. So after some more verbiage like this, depart from my sanctuary with your souls steeped in sorrow. This was the advice that the Delphic oracle gave Athens at the moment that Xerxes was on the march. Now the 2 Athenians said, we can't go back with that. We can't, that's defeatist. That's going to ruin everything, right? Nobody's going to fight if they've heard that opinion from the Delphic Apollo. So what they did, they knew that there was a trick you could pull with the Delphic Apollo. You could get a second opinion. And the way you did that was you had to come then as a suppliant, not just as a client with gifts, but you had to come expressing a great deal of subordination to this thing. And you had to pick up what they called supplicatory branches. In other words, you had to come in with these boughs of laurel or myrtle or whatever it was. And therefore, can't you give us a second opinion? Right? Can't we have a better response for the country? And the Pythia at this point says, well, don't quietly await the cavalry and infantry that in a mighty host are advancing from the mainland, but turn your back and withdraw. You shall live to fight another day. And mentions a few things about maybe ships or the ocean or something like this. This was also, however, basically saying, run for your lives, although in a slightly less purple rhetoric. They went back, these 2 Athenians, to their general Themistocles, and he was forced then to put his own spin on this, basically saying, well, indeed, why don't we try fighting in the water instead of on land? And this is then the Battle of Salamis, which the Greeks won against the Persians. But no thanks to the Delphic oracle, right, which was basically saying, run for your lives. And then when the Greeks, the Athenians, tried to give supplementary presents to the Delphic oracle as a result of the victory, saying, well, thanks to your prophecies, we did prevail. The Delphic oracle, was apparently the only time this ever happened, said, no, we can't take those presents from you, Athenians. So this obviously gave the Delphic oracle a bad name. Now, the other thing that the Delphic oracle did was its support of Rome. And I think this is the thing that I wanted to look at just a little bit also this evening. The Delphic oracle is basically anti-Etruscan. Remember that in the Italian peninsula at the time, when you had Rome starting off, the most advanced civilizations were these Etruscans in the north, Tuscany, right, Florence, whatever, Po, plain. And then in the south, from Naples all the way south, those were all Greeks, right? That was the so-called Magna Graeca. And remember that Naples continued to speak Greek all through the Roman Empire until it went way into the Middle Ages. That was a Greek city and not Italian. Nevertheless, the Delphic oracle supported Rome. And they did this with the same kind of public stress that you can see in the way that they supported Sparta or supported the Persian Empire against Athens and the other Greek cities. During the course of early Roman history, you have to remember that the Romans were this backward, uncouth, brutal, murderous bunch compared to most of their neighbors. They were inferior. But the Delphic Apollo supported them. For example, whenever they got into these wars with the Etruscan cities, like you read this in Titus Livius, right? Livy, the history of the Roman Republic. That whenever there's a battle, a war going on between, say, Veii. Veii is a large and relatively rich Etruscan city just a little bit north of Rome. That the Delphic Apollo was giving advice, what to do, how the Romans could overturn Veii, and they did. At a later point, the Delphic Apollo decided that they would give an unprecedented permanent endorsement of Rome. And they did this by singling out a special black stone, which was called the niger lapis. Very interesting thing. Right? Niger lapis, it just means black stone. That's all it means. The Black Stone Rangers, way back then. This was located in Greece, but it was the symbol of the Magna Mater. It was the Great Mother, Cybele. This was supposedly the dwelling place of the goddess Cybele. So the Delphic Apollo put out an opinion that this black stone had to be moved. And it had to be taken from Greece and put in the Roman Forum. And that's where it stayed. And there still is in the Roman Forum today. If you go there, there's a black stone that they claim is the one. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. So this was a permanent endorsement. In other words, this is something that was never really done for anybody in quite that form. Now, later on, in the Punic Wars, when Rome was fighting with Carthage, right, the great thing that decided who was going to dominate the central Mediterranean, during the days when Hannibal crossed his elephants over the Alps and was laying waste to all parts of Italy, the Delphic Apollo sent messages of encouragement to the Senate and the people of Rome, saying, hang on, keep fighting, don't give in, you can defeat Hannibal. And ultimately did. This is pretty much what happened. But again, with the help of the intelligence and the propaganda and the cults coming out of the Delphic Apollo. The other thing that we have to just recall is that in these days, after the death of Alexander the Great, there were kingdoms that grew up as the result of the falling apart of Alexander's empire. Right? These are the so-called, I guess they're sometimes called the epigones, the epigonoi. They're sometimes also called the diadochi. The generals, and if you were a big general under Alexander the Great, you had a pretty good chance of becoming king and founding a dynasty. And the cases of that are most interesting are the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. These were Greeks, basically, who set up a kingdom here in Egypt. And then the so-called Seleucids. The Seleucids was another general and his gang who took over Syria. Okay. The Delphic Apollo liked the Ptolemaic dynasty, supported them, which is interesting. We'll get it later on when you get to Cleopatra, because that's, of course, what she was. Now, when the Roman Empire came along, it's interesting to see which of the Roman emperors, or proto-emperors, were most supportive of the Delphic Apollo. Mark Antony, during the time that he dominated the eastern part of the Roman Empire, came forward as a protector of the Delphic Apollo, saying, I'm going to rebuild this place. It was burned down, of course, a number of times. That I'm going to fix it up again. The other emperors who were most in favor of the Delphic Apollo were Nero, who went there and actually he did some kind of an Indian giving operation. He gave them 100,000 sesterces, but then took away all their land, something like this. Domitian, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian. And it's interesting that there's a definite pattern that the emperors that were most friendly to the Delphic Apollo were also the most ferocious in persecuting the early Christians. Now later, this guy Plutarch, right? We don't want to forget him. When the Delphic Apollo had been more or less incorporated into the Roman system of things, Plutarch, the guy who writes these famous parallel lives, right, the lives of the noble Greeks and Romans, was a member of the priesthood. Right? He was somebody who operated as part of the priesthood of the Delphic Apollo. The last attempt to revive this thing in its old glory was the Emperor Julian the Apostate. Remember him? Remember, because Constantine became a Christian, so-called, and made the official religion of the Roman Empire became Arian Christianity with Constantine. But Julian the Apostate said, no, this is no good. Let's get back to the good old pagan ways. And he tried to build this significantly around the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. Now, the point of this is that this is the essence of what is metastasizing this thing. And again, it appears as a Greek institution, but what it really represents is this Whore of Babylon faction. It is the Babylonian Magi, the people that pop up, for example, around the Roman court. Right? The most famous example, I think you may remember, is the Emperor Tiberius, right? The one who presided over the crucifixion, had a Babylonian advisor by the name of Thrasyllus. Right? And people know the famous story about how Tiberius met Thrasyllus. Well, they're on this cliff of Capri, right? The island of Capri, near Naples. And what Tiberius would do is he would test these different soothsayers, and if he didn't like them, he'd have them thrown off the cliff. So here was Tiberius with a bunch of centurions and guards, and he went up to Thrasyllus and he said, "Let's see if this guy knows what's going on." So he asked him a couple of questions. He said, "Well, what do you see in my future?" And Thrasyllus looked into his crystal ball or his bird entrails or whatever he had, and he said, "Wait a minute. My picture is completely blurred by the fact that my life is in extreme danger." And Tiberius said, "This guy knows what's going on. Let's get him." So that's the type of the Babylonian magus. And these are the people that were present in the Roman Empire. Now, the way Lynn sums this stuff up now, what I'm going to try to do is to put a little bit of meat and bones on a sort of a skeleton that Lynn sets up, where he says that after the defeat of Carthage and Macedonia, and we can look at this in a second, it took about 150 years to figure out where the capital of the Roman Empire would be, who would be the dominant people, and how this would all happen, right? And get rid of all of the other pretenders, so forth. But the way that this happened was always under the influence of this Eastern force, this Babylonian Magi and Delphic Apollo. And that the center of gravity of the Roman Empire was always in the East. Right? And that places like Syria and Turkey and Greece remained Roman Empire long after Spain and France and Italy were not. See? Rome was not Rome anymore, but there was still a Roman Empire in the East for an extra 1,000 years. So somehow the roots of this phenomenon, right, the roots of the Roman imperial phenomenon are the deepest in the Eastern Mediterranean, and that's the center of gravity of the entire thing. And you can see this as you trace the course of these different civil wars. Now, let's just go through it, right? The Punic Wars. Here, we'll just try to we'll try to make short shrift of this stuff, right? Because otherwise it becomes this immense, Oxford Dictionary of Classical Civilization and all this stuff. You had 3 Punic Wars. It's Rome against Carthage, with the Delphic Apollo rooting for Rome. So that's 264 to 146 BC. Yeah. No, it's Tunisia. Still there. You go there today, and this is really funny. You go to Carthage, right? The ruins are there. At least the old story was that the Romans destroyed this place so completely that they even poured salt in the ground and nothing could ever grow there. You go there today, and there's the ruins. There are the ruins of what appears to be an old, Roman city, 300 AD, whatever. But the one thing that is Carthaginian is that there are these little stone boxes, stone like a shoebox, shoeboxes, but made of stone, made of marble. And you go and you say, what is that? Well, the Carthaginian religion, if you call it that, prescribed that you had to sacrifice your firstborn son to the ruler and to the god. So those were the poor little babies that were killed as a matter of state policy. All of them had to die and were put into these little shoeboxes. And you see them. They line the whole place. They're just all over the place when you go to what is today called Carthage, right? So they have, a rock and roll stage there, right? There's a place to have the summer festival. Okay, so that's, and these were bad, right? These are Phoenicians, right? Hannibal was certainly a good general, but this was a bad scene, and the culture was, this was just, well, I think I've said enough. So, the 3 Punic Wars against Carthage. These were the decisive ones, right? So this was essentially who was going to dominate the central Mediterranean. And Rome, again, with the help of the Delphic Apollo, won these things. If you want one date, the Battle of Zama, because we always talk about Cannae, right? Cannae is where Hannibal defeated the Romans. But Scipio Africanus, the Roman, then turned around and did the same thing to Hannibal at Zama in a somewhat less exemplary military thing. But that was basically the end of Hannibal. You had 3 Macedonian wars. The other power that was left in the middle of this Mediterranean was Macedonia, right? The basis of Alexander's old empire. And that was all finished by 168 BC. For those who were keeping score, that was called the Battle of Pydnia, quite famous in the ancient world. There was a Syrian war against the remnants of this Seleucid dynasty. So basically, when all is said and done, the result is that by 150 BC, everybody's defeated. Carthage is defeated, Macedonia is defeated, Syria defeated, and Rome rules the world. In which you already have a Roman Empire by 150 BC, which I think is a little bit surprising if people have thought about these chronologies. You think it usually, that came much later, right? It came around the time of the birth of Christ, right? It came around, 20 BC. But no, Rome was an empire, and it was already thoroughly decadent. All this, all the horrible stuff you see associate with, Nero and Caligula and people like that, that was all going immediately by about the middle of the 2nd century BC. This was a real bad scene. And of course, they were already decadent before they had any literature. Right? It was the Scipio Africanus and his group that basically concocted a literature around this time. Now, the question, therefore, is, between 150 BC and about 30 BC, when I guess we can say that Augustus consolidated the Roman Empire. I just want to check my dates here. Wouldn't want to be wrong. Approximately, that's just exactly right. So here's a period of 120 years of civil war. and all kinds of wars, but all within the Roman world now, all within the framework of this dominant Roman Empire. It calls itself Roman Republic, but it's an empire in every sense. So before you can get a fairly stable dynasty, you've got to have 120 years of civil war. Now I'll just mention a couple of these things to you, the way that it worked. First of all, the attempted reforms of Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. Remember that as a result of winning the Punic Wars, defeating Carthage, the Romans picked up Sicily. So what did they do with Sicily? Sicily was the richest agricultural area in the entire Mediterranean. It had the capability of feeding everybody. And the big policy issue, and this is what the Gracchi were interested in, was if you divided Sicily up and made it into family farms, you would have had a relatively prosperous, well-fed Mediterranean world. But that's not what the Roman Empire, Roman Republic did. They made it into latifundia, and they cultivated it with slaves. And that decision, that stuff was all decided between 200 and 150 BC. So pretty much the die was cast. And what the Gracchi then tried to do, I wouldn't think that the Gracchi were anything that great, but they simply said, we wish to distribute this to the poorest citizens, war veterans, and so forth. But that was too much for the senatorial party in Rome, who then killed them. And that really set off this 120 years of civil war. Now, the warlords of this period are a fascinating phenomenon. And some of these, I mean, Julius Caesar, I guess people know, but some of these others are absolutely extraordinary. There are two parties that come out of this. There's the so-called aristocratic party, which was led by a guy called Sulla, and the so-called plebeian party, led by another warlord called Marius. I guess these guys are forgotten today. They're not too well known. Well, that's the way fame is. Marius became famous because he was able to defeat the Germanic barbarians in southern France, in Aix-en-Provence. He won the Battle of Aix-en-Provence and defeated these blonde-headed characters. Marius was associated with another guy called Cinna. You know, in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, where the guy says, I'm Cinna the poet, I'm Cinna the poet, and he says, tear him anyway, tear him, tear him. This guy, these two, Marius was the general, and Cinna was sort of the Lavrenti Beria, right, the Gestapo. He went around killing everybody. And this was called proscriptions. Now remember, if you remember Antony and Cleopatra and these other plays by Shakespeare with the guy, they have these lists, and they say, okay, I'm going to put a dot next to everybody who's going to die. And the guy says, okay, your brother's going to get it. He says, yeah, and your nephew's going to get it, as they go through it, right? So they're going to kill everybody. So this is pretty much what they did. Now, Sulla conquered Greece. He finished off the conquest of Greece. He conquered Athens. He was the first Roman general into Athens. Sulla is also the first Roman to conquer Rome. He was the first Roman to militarily take over his own city. And Marius then did the same shortly thereafter. So this is called the social war. The other thing that got involved in this is, was everybody in Italy going to be a Roman citizen, or would some be Roman citizens and some not, and all the privileges and stuff that went with that, as you know, for example, from the life of St. Paul. And a civil war, and the proscriptions. So the social war, the civil war, yeah. No, I think Coriolanus is a separate person, isn't it? Yes, it's a different person. Now, where Coriolanus comes in on this stuff, now you got me. I don't know. Where does Coriolanus come in? I think earlier. I think Coriolanus is earlier than this. Right. Well, look, what came out of this is Marius had a nephew, okay, and that's Julius Caesar. And out of the Sulla group, you get, in particular, Pompey the Great, and Crassus. So what it simply means is that these two guys fight a civil war for several decades, and then they are superseded by another generation of warlords But see, now the warlord stuff has taken on a life of its own, and there's a whole part of the population that have been nothing but these Wallenstein bandits, right? So it becomes a social phenomenon in that sense. So now we get Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, and L. Crassus. Now, up to now it was Marius against Sulla. That's passé. Now it's a three-way division. And this is what they call the first triumvirate. Now, L. Crassus. Money. Money. Big money. He's a tycoon, millionaire, and brutal political boss. Perot. The Perot of first century Rome was L. Crassus. Now, what he did, this is actually funny, he got into messing with the Persian Empire, the Parthian Empire. Because no matter what the Romans did, they could not conquer what is today Iraq. They never made it. In other words, the Euphrates River was something the Romans never could permanently get beyond. And beyond the Euphrates, there was always this thing that called itself Persian Empire or Parthian Empire, and then again Persian Empire. So L. Crassus said, look, I'm taking the money. He went into Syria, looted all the temples, crossed the Euphrates, started looting. Persian army came in and defeated him and killed him. And then they took his dead body, this is what Dante records in the Divine Comedy, and poured molten gold into the mouth of the corpse to say, look, you wanted it, now you're going to get it. Tell us what it tastes like, Crassus. What's the flavor of gold? So these guys they all died. They all came to a bad end. Julius Caesar, he conquered what was left of Spain, France, England, up to Scotland, but was then killed by this conspiracy, right? This is the one thing that people know. Pompey is actually more interesting from our point of view tonight. And what he did is that Pompey is the one who added the Eastern Mediterranean to the Roman Empire, which Pompey did get as far as the Euphrates and permanently added most of that. For example, if you remember, how did the Romans get Jerusalem? How did they conquer what is today Israel and the Holy Land? Pompey the Great did that. So he basically took Turkey, Syria, Jerusalem, and the Maccabees were trying to resist Pompey the Great. Right? That was at least one of the phases of the Maccabees. So this rapidly went, obviously, the way that it had to go. Caesar, well, Crassus was out of the picture with his gold. Caesar then got into a fight with Pompey, and this then led to this battle of Pharsalia, which was won decisively by Caesar. And Pompey fled across to Egypt and was murdered. And then shortly thereafter, Caesar was murdered. So they're all dead. The whole first triumvirate were all slaughtered. Now, the interesting thing about Pompey is that he gives you the idea of somebody who wanted this Eastern-centered empire. In other words, his main base was the Roman East. That's what he conquered. And when he got into the final phase of the civil war with Caesar, he went to Greece and tried to draw strength from Turkey, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and try to fight based on that, although he failed. Pompey actually got all the way around the Black Sea. He got into what is today Georgia. Extraordinary, right? The way in which these things were done. But of course it's just horrible because it's one continuous slaughter. And then we get this second triumvirate, the one that you know then from Julius Caesar by Shakespeare, which is Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus. And Octavian, of course, was this sort of androgynous, dubious sexual orientation character. Mark Antony was a brutal political organizer and infighter. And Lepidus was a person, I guess, of relatively little consequence. They gave him Africa, and that was the end of him. The interesting thing about this phase is that when we get to this, it very soon became that Octavian, the later Augustus, had the West, and Mark Antony had the East. And Mark Antony's basic policy was the Cleopatra card. And Cleopatra represented not what you think. It was not just this hedonistic apparatus, right? But what Cleopatra represented was the idea that the capital of the Roman Empire should be in Alexandria, and that it should be an Eastern-centered empire from the word go. Now, this is actually what they tried to do. You see, Cleopatra had cohabited with Julius Caesar for a while. So she had the principal living biological heir of Julius Caesar was her son that she kept. This is known as Ptolemy Caesar, or Caesarion. And one ceremony that they held when Mark Antony was with Cleopatra in Alexandria, they basically had this proclamation, which was read by Mark Antony, that Cleopatra was the queen of kings, and that little Caesarion was the king of kings, that he was essentially the Roman emperor, but in Alexandria. So there you see it, I think, most clearly, that the fight was about whose dynasty was going to rule, where would the capital be, and what other arrangements would go into this. But the general framework had already been set up by the Delphic oracle. So then, as people know, the way in which this was then finally decided, and I promised I will look into this a bit more because I think this is another fascinating episode, is that Augustus, or Octavian, wanted to secure the support of this Babylonian Magi faction, the Delphic Apollo group, and that he therefore met with their representatives on the island of Capri and said, well, look, I will certainly cultivate the Magna Mater and Cybele in Rome, but otherwise what I will do is I will bring in Mithra. I will bring in the Mithra cult from the East and make that the principal cult of the Roman legions. Now this Mithra, right? Mithra is this. Mithra is a religion that is explicitly based on homosexuality. It's a. If you go to Wiesbaden, for example, one of the interesting things in Wiesbaden along the Rhine, wherever Roman legions went, you will find a Mithraeum, and the Mithraeum is a kind of an underground temple which has got to do with this bull, which is stung then by a scorpion, and there's this youth called Mithra, I believe, who's also part of the picture. For example, one of the kings running around in the Black Sea at this time is King Mithridates, right? So he's the living representative of Mithra. So that's how it was done. And it meant then that the Roman legions, which were the most important single institution in the entire thing, they were very largely homosexual, and they were then filled with this Mithra cult. And maybe just before we leave this, the Roman legion had been set up in its modern form for then, by Marius. And it was essentially this group of 6,000 people with this heavy armament, and they found that they could defeat the Macedonian phalanx, that the Roman legion was unbeatable and remained so at least for a certain amount of time. The principal social institution of the empire was the legion, and it was the legions who chose the emperor, in effect, but always under the guidance of these spin doctors. All right. With that, I guess we've had an interesting look, I hope, into what this period of 130, 150 years of civil war was actually like. Now let us conclude with the question of Diocletian, okay? Because we'll have to continue next time. Well, I don't know what to do. Now, in terms of this Roman Empire, the first bunch of emperors, as you know, were these monsters, right? Augustus kept it a little bit under control, but then we had Tiberius and Nero and Claudius and Caligula And this was simply a bloodbath, right, as people know. Right? There's just no limit to this stuff. After that, there was a certain backlash against it, and you had these other Flavian emperors who basically said, no, we don't want to have that. We don't want to have quite as much killing as we had in the Tiberius. We're not like that, right? This is when Tacitus was allowed to write, and Suetonius was allowed to write, basically saying, we're not like those bad old emperors that have been around. And you go through this period of about, 150 years of Pax Romana, right? It was a long peace, but it didn't last forever. And that's the interesting thing that gets us to Diocletian and these points that are of perhaps most interest today. See, the collapse of the Roman Empire actually came quicker than most people think. If we think of the year 180 AD, we have Marcus Aurelius. Right? Has anybody ever seen that movie with Alec Guinness, The Fall of the Roman Empire? With Marcus Aurelius is up on the Danube fighting the Germanic tribes? No? It's been on cable lately. You see? Now, he was already, the big thing with Marcus Aurelius was that he was fighting these Wotan guys, right? The guys who were yelling Wotan and coming to kill you, right, as best they could. And what you had then was a period of about 100 years of absolute collapse, and it got to be worse. The worst phase was from about 230 AD to 280 AD. So it was a collapse that began in 180 AD, and it was principally the pressure of Goths, Vandals, right, other of these tribes coming out of Central Asia along all the borders of the empire. So along the Rhine, along the Danube, and the Euphrates, right? But especially the Rhine and the Danube were the most threatened. And really, the entire Roman Empire basically collapsed by about 280 AD, with civil wars, right, provinces going off under warlords, as we've seen before. Now, Diocletian is the person who tried to fix this. And he fixed it in a way from which Europe really did not recover for certainly 500 years, but really for 1,000 years. It took 1,000 years to get over the wonderful reforms of Diocletian. So this was an attempt to revive the Roman Empire, reorganize it, and endow it with greater stability. And this is immediately germane to all of the stuff that's going around us politically today. Now, Diocletian was a kind of a commoner. He was not a representative of the senatorial families or of the Babylonian Magi directly. But he was somebody who had grown up in warfare, civil wars, fighting these barbarians. He was from Dalmatia. So in effect, he was a Croatian. I mean, if he was anything, he was a Croatian. Now, he decided to institute these reforms. Now, I'm going to try to go through them in sort of ascending order of importance. So we'll get to the really important stuff at the end. We'll start with some of the stuff that's rather interesting. He said, first of all, that the Roman Empire had to have an administrative reform. That it was no good to have one emperor, but that the empire had to be divided, east and west. But he actually divided it 4 ways. This is the so-called tetrarchy. And what he did was he said, well, first of all, we're going to divide it east and west. And in the east, we're going to have one senior emperor, an Augustus, and one junior emperor, a Kaiser, a Caesar. And we'll do the same thing in the east. We'll have a senior emperor, me, and then we'll have a junior Kaiser. So Augustus, better, and Caesar, inferior to that. So where were they located? Well, he said, I'm going to put one in Trier, in Germany, to guard the Rhine. Then I'm going to put an Augustus in Milan to guard the Alps and what they would call Gaul, right, the southern part of Gaul. A third of these emperors operated from the Sava River in the middle of what was Yugoslavia until recently. And Diocletian himself chose to operate from at the very edge of Europe on the shores of the Sea of Marmara, opposite Turkey. So he was basically on the coast of Europe looking over to Asia across the Sea of Marmara. That is where Diocletian himself chose to operate from. Now, Diocletian wanted respect. He wanted respect. So what he did was he took what he understood to be the court ritual of the Persian Empire and introduced it into the Roman Empire, which meant, for example, eunuchs, right? As the computer people would say, he had a Unix-based system. So the court was full of these eunuchs, right? And with everything that goes with that, right? And one of these historians here, this guy, John Julius Norwich, he writes, he says, if you ever known a eunuch, you know that you don't want to cross them. Don't ever get on the wrong side of a eunuch. So this entire thing that he was deified. In other words, what you think of as the Byzantine Empire really starts with this, that the emperor is a god. He was called Jovius. He's the earthly representative of Zeus as Augustus. And then his other guy, the second Augustus, the junior Augustus, was called Hercules. He's also a god, but he's sort of more earthbound, and he's the guy who's really strong and helps Jovius to do all the important stuff. Now, they had to do the military reform. Now, this is called Diocletian's peace dividend. You saw that under Marius, the Roman legion had about 6,000 men. So Diocletian said, no, that's too much. We want to have lean and mean units. So now the legion is only going to be 1,000. And he had an estimated, he increased the army actually from 400,000 to 500,000. That's what he left it at. 500,000 men under arms. Quite large, huh? Now, he also did this. He divided them between garrison troops and field troops. And the interesting thing is, what he wanted to defend was the so-called limes. Now, you see all those books talking about limes, right? And probably, what does it mean? It simply means the border, right? Limes limitis means the frontier, the border. In particular, it means something like Hadrian's Wall up in Scotland, right, on the border with Scotland, or Trajan's Wall over in Romania, right? They have these walls, like the Great Wall of China, right, but smaller. So there were some troops were called limitanei, and those were the garrison troops that staffed the walls and the border. And then you had others who were the mobile units and stuff like this. So it's also interesting that a lot of the words that are associated with European nobility, like dux, right? A duke was originally a lower grade officer of these legions, or a count, a comes comitis, was a higher ranking officer. Interestingly, it's reversed compared to what you'd think. Okay. Now, of course, the main thing was money. It was taxation. Taxation. That sound familiar? You can imagine, if you want to have an imperial reorganization. So here's what he did. Diocletian said we have to have the predictability of revenue. So he got into this sort of, he did it in a different way. It's more sinister. He did it in this sort of doomsday book way. In other words, what he wanted was a census to know all of the wealth of the empire. And that was then going to be taxed. And it was taxed through what is called capitatio. Capitatio is head tax. Sometimes it turned into decapitatio when you got finished paying. But this was on all wealth. There were other kinds of assessments, this sort of indictio, which was something that they would proclaim at different points every 5 years or something like this. Now, the tax burden was increased. And this essentially destroyed society. Already with this, he was destroying society. And here is how it worked. He said, if we have a Roman province, and he had made more of them, right? He had about 100 provinces. He said, I'm going to make the city council of the principal city and the other cities, they will be personally responsible for paying the taxes, which I'm going to assess based on this census, right, this doomsday book operation that I've got, to know what the wealth is. Now, the people who were therefore called to pay were these, you'd call them the bourgeoisie, I suppose, right? In other words, the well-to-do middle class and traders of the towns. They were the ones who were left holding the bag. And here's the way it would work. You already had by this time barons. There was somebody with a huge farm, a huge latifundium, and slaves, and a fortress sitting in the middle. And these poor guys from the city would come out and they'd say, hey, baron, time to pay your taxes, right? And the guy would start shooting arrows or pouring molten lead over the walls. And they couldn't collect the tax. But Diocletian's boys said, wait a minute, you're now responsible for the tax. And these bourgeoisie types said, well, what, us? Then they attempted in the cities to tax the lower orders in the cities. And from this they got class war. In other words, they got revolutions in the cities. And ultimately, it turned out that people said, well, if this is what it means to be a well-to-do middle-class person in a Roman city, I'm leaving. I'm going to join the army. I'm going to become a monk, a bandit, a wayfarer, whatever. And then Diocletian turned around and said, wait a minute, you can't do that. I am making your station in life hereditary and compulsory. In other words, if you're a bourgeois of the city, you're going to stay in the city, and your son, your oldest son, is going to be forced to take your place. And he has no choice in the matter. And you'll see that this got to be an important principle. So the towns were destroyed by the taxes. Then the other people were the so-called coloni, tenant farmers. So they then had a heavy burden of tax that they had to bear. What Diocletian originally said is you should pay in kind, and you should be a sharecropper, basically. Pay part of your tax with food or whatever your crop is. But they then began to build up tremendous amounts of debts also. So they basically said, let's go on to the next province. So, let's see what the Parthian Empire looks like, right? Let's try that. And then Diocletian turned around and said, wait a minute, you can't. You are now bound to the land. It is now illegal to leave the land. And that is serfdom. In other words, that is the origin of European serfdom, was that the people on the land, these coloni, the sharecroppers and others, who were theoretically free, were then bound to the land to prevent them from getting out from under this crushing tax burden. All right, so you've also got now the phenomenon of lawlessness. Society is collapsing, right? The tissue of society is collapsing as a result of all this stuff, because some people are running away, right? They're bandits and warlords and so forth. So the idea is that everybody tries to build up some kind of an impregnable fortress somewhere to operate out of there. And this is the so-called patrocinium. It's feudalism. In other words, it basically says, well, I'm just a little sharecropper. I'm now a serf. Lord, will you take me into your entourage? Can I become a part of your operation so that when the Huns come, I can take refuge in your castle and so forth? It's what you see in Bosnia or Croatia or these other places. As soon as you have warlords, you've got to join one of these gangs, otherwise you're going to be caught in the middle and ground up. Now, it gets worse. Now, what I'm describing, these are called Diocletian's reforms, but in many cases, they were only completed under Constantine. And of course, Constantine is the one who then made this division of the Eastern and Western Roman Empire permanent. He's the founder of the Orthodox Church, right? He's iso-apostolic. But here's what he did, along with Diocletian. One of Diocletian's last things was his price control decree. De maximis pretiis, maximum prices. So this was 301 AD, and he said, I am hereby setting maximum prices for approximately 1,000 of the most important items. So all kinds of food, wheat, bread, all kinds of wine, sheep, gold, labor in different... Right? So in other words, a completely totalitarian approach to economics. If you want to know, for example, where communism comes from, this is where communism comes from. The tendency of the Byzantine society to view economic activity as a fully controlled department of the state. So it's what essentially this then led to was chaos. It was obviously a tremendous black market. It reminded me, when you read these descriptions, you think of Russia today. It was if you try to have these kinds of economic dislocations, even though it's going in the opposite direction, you're going to get a black market, profiteering, the economy of scarcity, raids to try to seize, hoarding, all this kind of stuff. So far we've got Diocletian brings you feudalism, serfdom, and now we have the guilds. And this is actually the most interesting. See, we always say the Diocletian reforms forbade technological innovation. Now, you think of this in Latin, there's really no way even to say that, or to think it, right? You can't say, alterare technologiam non licet. It doesn't, and this is not the way they did it. They didn't come out and say, you're not allowed to have technological change. Here's what they did. The production was organized according to these guilds, corporations, right, in the sense of the medieval corporations, the ones that Mussolini talked about, or Gabriele D'Annunzio, these sorts of people. So you had these guilds. Now, they started off with ship owners, the people who actually owned boats that were used for transportation. So again, as in all of these areas, people were trying to get out. They were trying to say, look, I can't stay here, I'm losing money, and I can't stay, I want to leave. And the Roman state of Diocletian said, no, wait a minute, your function is compulsory and hereditary. And it meant that if you were born to a family of the ship owners guild, that was your destiny. You had to do it, presumably on pain of death. And then this was expanded. They thought that worked so well that they took the millers, the bakers, the butchers, the shoemakers, the carpenters, the bricklayers, and all of the other principal trades, and made these compulsory and hereditary. And then, of course, the technology part comes in the following way. They then said, we're defending these guilds. It is illegal to alter or buy or sell the property of a guild. And that was it. See, once you've said that, then you have said, in effect, that no technological change is allowed. You say, we're defending the guilds. We want stability. We want sustainable development. We're going to fix everybody into these posts, right? You've got your profession determined from birth. The property of the guild is sacrosanct, can't be changed, and therefore, we've got it. And of course, what they had then was 500, probably about 300 or 400 years straight down in most of the world in which this was applied, which was a significant part of the world. This was then the very, very long night of the Dark Ages. This was the collapse of the tissue of civilization in a way that has hardly ever been seen before. And of course, everybody retreating into these little fortresses, serfdom, the guilds, the cities essentially collapsing, emptying out, grass growing. Right? Rome itself, a sheep meadow once again, after not too long, and so on. So that's Diocletian. Now, we can probably just go on a little bit further if people still have blood sugar for it. And just what we may be able to do is just to begin to account for some of the moments of metastasis in here after Diocletian. See, what you have with Diocletian is it's still the Roman world, but it's beginning to show you the Dark Ages and feudalism. But feudalism in its ugly, backward, brutal, gangster-ridden genocidal aspect. Well, yeah.
Were you planning to stop at this point, or?
No, I think we can go on for a few more minutes. I just want to begin to indicate some of the transition points into from Byzantium to Venice. Maybe another 10 or 15 minutes. Okay? I don't really have a plan that detailed.
No, I just had a question on
sure, go ahead.
Diocletian becomes emperor
Yes.
as a commoner.
Well, during this time, I mean, if you begin to look at these emperors, by the time you get into the 200s and the 200s in particular, is that you have an emperor who's an Arab. You have a number of emperors who I believe were black. You have many emperors killed. You have, rival emperors at different points. And above all, generals. Right? It was, if you were proclaimed by the legion, you were the emperor. And if you could say, well, my family is 10,000 years old, and the centurion would put a spear through you, and that would be the end of you. So it was, to that extent, it was a civil war. I mean, really, what you get the idea is, except for that Pax Romana, except for this a period of relative exhaustion in the century or so after Augustus, it was one civil war from beginning to end. Although when you get to Diocletian, it begins to get into this fixed mode, but of course then the constant local warfare going on becomes the big thing, and then of course ultimately the invasions. So he did not, it was not a patrician empire at that point. It was basically people who were, desperate adventurers. It's very funny, you look at Diocletian. Diocletian considered himself to be an administrator, rational, and a financier. He said, I'm a better financier than Vespasian, and I'm a better administrator than Augustus. You know that Vespasian was the guy who introduced paid toilets. The Italian and French word for an outdoor toilet is Vespasiano or Vespasien, right? And this was Vespasian. He's earlier. He's not so late. And they asked him. They said, Vespasian, don't you feel that somehow this money coming into the treasury from these paid toilets is somehow an insult? And this is the famous pecunia non olet. That money doesn't smell to me. So I mean, it's a nightmare. Although you can't trivialize this stuff though, because what you have to think of is Diocletian. I mean, think of Diocletian. Think of that administrative machine with his 500,000 troops, and he's telling you what to do with your life. Right? He's telling you what you're going to do down into the smallest detail. In other words, it's totalitarianism. It's totalitarianism, and it's a world government. In other words, it is exactly what this UN thing would be. Now, you look at somebody like Boutros Boutros-Ghali. Look at some of these people. Look at that guy, that Japanese guy in Bosnia, Ahashi, or whatever his name is. Right? You look at these people. What are you dealing with? You're dealing with these Roman imperial administrators in some kind of a new form. So anyway, look, out of this collapse, we'll just try to get some idea of the transition from Byzantium to Venice. Now, remember, Rome in the West, right, as every schoolboy used to know, the end of the Roman Empire in the West was? No? No? This is what every schoolboy used to know. What? No, come on. 476 A.D. Oh my gosh. Roman history wasn't too popular. This is what they say anyway. No. The sack of Rome the sack of Rome is about 150 years before that. But this is supposedly the complete end of the whole thing. And of course you can dispute this, right? You can say it's 50 years earlier, 50 years later. But remember, in light of this thesis that the real center of the Roman Empire was in the east, and that the capital of the Roman Empire, if it had been Sulla, if it had been Pompey, or if it had been Mark Antony, the capital would probably have been Alexandria or someplace like that in the east. Rome east goes another 1,000 years, right? Up until 1453 AD, right? And the fall of Constantinople. And that again is a nightmare vision, because that's pretty much under Diocletian, this Diocletian-Constantine regime as reformed about 500 by Justinian. Ooh. All right, but that then brings us to Venice. Now, how in God's name did this imperial eagle, right, this purple-trimmed imperial eagle of the Roman Empire, how did this end up in Venice, in this strange lagoon at the northern end of the Adriatic Sea? How did the empire, so to speak, pass that way? Well, it grows. The origins of this, at least in the legends, are not so far from Diocletian and Constantine, right? The original idea is that the people who founded Venice were looking for a refuge. At this point, right, in line with this patrocinium that I was talking about, and these private fortresses and barons, right, the barony, the typical thing is a Benedictine monastery, right? You look at Mont Saint-Michel in France, right? It's a Benedictine monastery. It's a fortress off the edge of the coast with only quicksand in between. Or then you look at Monte Cassino, another Benedictine monastery, right? A fortress, enough to be a fortress in the Second World War, which it was. And then Venice is another such example, again, a Benedictine monastery, a bit later, in this lagoon center. Now, the people who settled Venice were allegedly fleeing from the Goths to start with, but ultimately it was Attila the Hun. At least that's the legend. So the official legendary foundation of Venice is not so long after Diocletian. It's 421 AD, I believe. Again, people running away from Attila the Hun who gathered in the middle of the lagoon at the Rialto or someplace like this and decided that they were going to stay there. Now, who knows? I certainly can't tell you, but it's an interesting legend. The election of the first Doge is approximately 700 AD, they claim. But when can you say that this metastasis begins? In other words, that there's some identifiable phenomenon that the center of oligarchism in Byzantium is being moved into Venice. And I guess, well, certainly 800 AD is an important date, right? This period of Charlemagne. Because the way in which Venice was actually consolidated was in a war against Charlemagne. But Charlemagne wanted to destroy Venice. This was a good thing to do. And he had Pepin as a general attacking Venice, but unfortunately not being able to wipe it out. And this war went on for quite a while. You see, what the Venetians did at this point was they felt that they were strong enough to say, we are not part of Western civilization. That was the fundamental self-assertion that they made. We're not part of Charlemagne's empire. We're part of the Byzantine Empire. That was how they pulled themselves together. They denied that they were part of Italy and the West, and that they wanted to be. This was actually propaganda. In other words, when you had Pepin's forces on the mainland saying, you know, how do you dare to oppose the Emperor Charlemagne? And they say, no, we support the Byzantine Emperor. We're his guys. So the key moment is 811 AD, the Pax Nicephori. And the Pax Nicephori is essentially a treaty between the Byzantine Emperor and Charlemagne, who at this point was just about dying. He was at the very end of his life, saying, okay, Venice is part of the Byzantine Empire. So with that, they had it. In other words, they had gotten all of the main contenders to agree that they were something very, very special, that they were not indeed part of the West. Now, you read these Venetian stories, and you'll see that during the next couple of hundred years, the first Byzantine princesses began to arrive, because it now became the best way to promote your family was to bring in a Byzantine princess for a bride. And there are these accounts where these Venetians say, look, she's got this thing. She's got this little metal contraption, and when she sees something she wants to eat, she skewers it, puts it in her mouth. But they'd never seen a fork until the Byzantine princesses arrived. And what you also see is that they hated these Byzantine princesses, and indeed that quite a number of them died relatively soon after coming into Venice. So I would say this period of the Byzantine princesses is something about 800 to 1000 A.D. But now you're building up towards the big important date, and I think the moment when you can say that the transition is actually made is this period about 1200 A.D., which is your Fourth Crusade. And you know the story, right? We have the Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, who's in touch with these French feudal knights, right, who were, backward and clods, oafs, militarists, whatever, but greedy, dumb. And for some reason they say, oh, well, we have to go on this pilgrimage to Jerusalem and free the holy sites and the sepulchre of the Lord from the Saracens, right, the Arabs, from Muhammad. And they get to Venice. They don't have any money. So the Venetians say, look, we'll take you to Jerusalem, but first, let's try to knock off a local city here in the Adriatic that's been giving us trouble. And I think they decide that they're going to go to Zara, one of these Italian cities on the other side of the Adriatic. So they go there and conquer that. And the Venetians say, okay, now we're going to take you to Jerusalem, except they don't take them to Jerusalem. They take them to Constantinople. And these French guys say, all right, Constantinople, it's all the same. And they then attack, conquer, and destroy Constantinople, including the burning of the library. Right? And between, if you want to keep track of these things, the burning of the Alexandrian library during the Antony and Cleopatra episode knocked out a lot of what we would have known about the ancient world. But the really big one was the destruction of the library in Constantinople by the Venetians and these French oafs in the Fourth Crusade of 1200 A.D. And these funny stories. Have you ever seen these 4 horses? There are these 4 bronze horses that stood at the hippodrome, the racetrack, in downtown Constantinople, Byzantium. And the Venetians got these. And they took them to Venice, right? And they're now displayed on the front porch of St. Mark's Basilica. And there are these 4 horses. And the way that they got them was, this was a crusade against the infidel, but of course it just destroyed the biggest Christian city that was there. Because the only poetic justice was when Napoleon finally conquered Venice, he stole the horses, but the horses then found their way back. And they're there, and what you find is that these Olivetti and these people, they now send, if you want to, you want to ante up like $25 million, they'll send you 1 horse for 3 months or something like that. Yeah, they will. If you want to do an exhibition in St. Louis or something, right? If the local Chamber of Commerce co-ops up, then they'll send you 1 horse, or you want 2 horses? It gets up to 100 million very, very quickly. So by this time, it's very clear that Dandolo and company, the Venetian oligarchy, have taken over the Byzantine Empire, right? And they then created, this is funny because Dandolo had promised, he said, to the oligarchs of Venice, he said, if you guys play along with me, I'm going to get you all the gold in the world. And came close, right, by conquering Byzantium. And from this point on, Venice officially proclaimed itself to be the lord of 1/4 and 1/2 of 1/4 of the Roman Empire. Because remember, that the Byzantine Empire, to the very end, never called itself Byzantine Empire. It called itself Roman Empire. Right? That's what the official name of it. Indeed, you can go to Greece today. If you go to a Greek peasant and ask, what is your nationality? He'll say, I am Romios. I am a Roman. I'm a citizen of the Roman Empire. That's what a peasant will tell you, because it's reached down to that level of the language. Now, I guess the interesting thing for us is to see that with this, the Venetians had actually, they had seized control of the Mediterranean. They were now the dominant force in the entire Mediterranean. And what this then led to was within 150 years, an absolutely devastating crash. In other words, the most horrendous since the Dark Ages. In other words, this Dark Age that began about 1300 and went on until about, say, 1400, until the beginning of the Renaissance. And of course, what that had to do with was that they now created the Latin Empire, right? In other words, the Venetian Empire of Byzantium, and they began otherwise to wipe out any opposition in the central Mediterranean. The main opposition in the wake of this was Frederick II of Hohenstaufen. So what they did was, the Venetians, given the fact that, you know, that the Byzantine court, by virtue of the fact that you can go up the Dnieper and get to the Baltic, right? You know this stuff? You go up the rivers and you have a little portage, and you can, Byzantium is always very close to the Scandinavians. Byzantine emperor always had a Danish or Swedish personal guard. So that's the secret of the Normans, right? The Vikings, was that they were encouraged by the Byzantines. You know, why don't you go destroy northern France, you Vikings? Why don't you go destroy England? And eventually, why don't you go and destroy Sicily, which is what they did. With these transplanted Vikings from France came in and took over Sicily and kicked out Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, killed his son, killed his grandson. And with that, you have the whole central Mediterranean pitching right down into this horrible, horrible decline, right? The Black Death. And, you know, what we've called the Bardi and Peruzzi, although it's probably less the Bardi and Peruzzi than it is these Venetian banking houses themselves. So they certainly controlled the territory there in the middle of the Mediterranean for a couple of centuries. But with these consequences, in other words, the perfect moment of dominance then turned into the moment of this.
The other side of the story was this. From over the course of the 12th and 13th century into the 14th century, a form of evil which is directly traced by the Venetians themselves to the ancient Canaanite city of Tyre had arisen to great power in the north of the Adriatic Sea, the city of Venice, which has been in recent time, until he moved to London, the residence of Satan on earth. These people great power. They built a maritime power in the image of ancient Phoenicia, which is Canaan. Phoenicia is a Greek word. The people of that region were called the Canaanites. And the center of evil was Tyre. Tyre was destroyed by a great man, Alexander the Great. But the principle of Tyre lived on. And it came through the Roman Empire, it came to reside in Venice. And from about 800 AD on, Venice was an increasing power in the Mediterranean. It became a great sea power, which became a dictatorship over the Mediterranean over the period from the course of the 12th century into the beginning of the 13th century with the so-called Fourth Crusade. And I can tell you all the Crusades were frauds. They were all run by the Venetians. Nothing to do with Christianity. They had to do with something else. The Fourth Crusade was organized by Venice to conquer and loot Byzantium, which is its major competitor. And the Latin Empire in Byzantium was set up from 1204 to 1261, when a fellow called Michael Paleog overthrew it on behalf of the Greeks. But Venice became a great looting power. It crushed every element of civilization It imposed evil cults. It spread the cult of Aristotle throughout the Mediterranean and other cults. It looted everything. It imposed its debt every place. It manipulated nations into making war on one another. They weren't real nations, but they were whatever passed for at that time. They plunged Europe into war and usury and looting and bestiality and cruelty. And nothing could seem to stop it. The political institutions of Europe collapsed at about 1250, or over the period 1250 to 1267, in a series of wars. A leading figure of the late 13th century and early 14th century, Dante Alighieri, typified those who fought desperately to save civilization from this pestilence of Venice and the Venetians' Mongol allies, who are attacking Europe from the west, from the east. Venice's power grew. Dante was probably murdered by the Venetians after a trip into Venice and its area. The ideas of Dante lived on through various networks. Not only Dante, but there were great Franciscans and others who continued the tradition, the Augustinian tradition, and developed it then as before. Then in the middle of the century, the 14th century, the whole system collapsed in a chain reaction of bankruptcy, starting with the King of England discovering, by checking with his priest, that not only was usury a mortal sin, but that he, as the King of England, by continuing to pay his debts to usury, was actually contributing to the eternal damnation of the soul of his creditors. So the King of England repudiated his debts to the houses of Bardi and Peruzzi, which were Florentine-based, but they were key bankers of the period, who had looted every part of Europe through this bank. It's very much like the IMF conditionalities today. As a matter of fact, the IMF conditionalities are a repetition, a continuation of the Venetian tradition. They are evil. The people who run the IMF are evil. The bureaucrats of the IMF as a collectivity are purely evil. They are mass murderers. They have already killed far more people on this planet than Adolf Hitler succeeded in doing. They are wiping out the people of developing countries. What they've contributed to with their English masters, including Linda Chalker, who is the colonial minister, they call it overseas development now, but she's really the colonial minister from the House of Lords, who was given to us by Lady Thatcher, who was reputed to be a witch because she succeeded in transforming a merely bankrupt England into a rubbish heap. And also because of the way she handled her pet cat, George Bush. Who, by the way, is no friend of mine. So these people were crushed, and their political power was crushed by their bankruptcy. There's an analogy today. I'm not Plutarch, and I'm not a priest of the cult of Apollo, as he was, but comparisons are sometimes permitted. Today, as then, in the middle of the 14th century, the new Venetian Empire, which is the British Empire, or the Anglo-Dutch Empire, or whatever you want to call it, it's the same thing, is based on financial power. All finance and monetary systems today are divorced entirely from trade and production. They're engaged in pure speculation, in usury, debt as a form of usury, the looting of countries, of whole regions of the world, the power of the ruling oligarchy, which are like Venetian families, Ford Foundation, this foundation, that foundation. This is what runs the United States, not the government. This is what runs the world, not the governments. The governments are run by these powerful families and their oligarchical connections, who control the Washington Post. They control the New York Times. They control the 3 TV networks. They control Jane Fonda. She might not admit it, but she's a real right-wing fascist, that Jane. They are looting the world. They have great power. People are afraid of them. They're afraid of the press. The Congress is afraid of the press. The Justice Department is controlled by these families. Everything is rotten is controlled by these families. People say, be smart, don't get into trouble. Don't attack them. Don't attack the Queen of England. How can you not attack her? She's killing all those people. You're going to keep quiet about it? What, are you going to involve in misprision of a felony by not attacking the Queen of England? So the time has come, we say, well, what if these people suddenly lose their financial power? What if these banks go bankrupt? What if the IMF is liquidated? What if the international monetary institutions don't function? What if there's no facility by which these institutions can exert their power over society? Something like that which happened during the 14th century, the so-called Dark Age. Well, the problem was
when in 1000 the Byzantine Empire underwent a fundamental crisis. That was the period when Venice started to take over more and more of Europe, and eventually the power center shifted to the financial oligarchy in Venice. So then in 1066 the Normans took over England, and the Saxons got defeated. And then eventually, Venice for a very long time remained the power center of the imperial structure. So you are really looking at a succession of different empires. Now, naturally, Venice in this period, in this long period, underwent changes, family changed, replaced others, but the oligarchical structure essentially remained the same.
Centuries had passed from the day the ruling families left Rome, and the Venetians rapidly asserted a maritime dominance that no one could or would dare to challenge. Recognizing her might, the Istrians begged Venice for protection from Slavic pirates. This protection was granted gracefully, at the price of 100 jars of wine per year. Though her mother, Byzantium, interfered with her desire of controlling a global financial maritime empire, as Byzantium still controlled the trade routes of the East, Venice overcame these circumstances and managed to secure trading privileges over Byzantium's territories. They accomplished this by making the emperor fearful of foreign attack, an attack which Venice herself was well equipped to foment. The 20 to 30 ruling Venetian families prided themselves on being descendants of the imperial Rome of Caesar, but whether they were really related by flesh or not, they were descendants of Rome's imperial ideology, for this oligarchy was clearly committed to the ancient model that created Rome, and were determined to ensure that Venice would embody empire.
Be thou unique in the isolation of thy sight. None shall resemble thee. In thy freedom from pope and emperor, none shall rival thee. The city thou buildest on the ooze of the lagoon shall outlast the rock-built cities of the crag and the broad-laid cities of the plain. Out of thine incessant combat with the sea shall come thy strength. Thy soul shall delight in beauty, and beautiful shall be thy handiwork.
Of course, anything that could come from the handiwork of Venice would be anything but beautiful. Her handiwork was one of dumping many into wars, while making them believe that the Venetians were really their ally, and that they shared common interest. Like its descendants in the British Empire of today, Venice had no permanent allies, only permanent interests. To gain her interests, emperors and kings were to play her game, and if they refused or retaliated, they would simply meet their doom. Byzantium was one significant force that chose not to play her game. This was troublesome, for without Constantinople she would lose access to the Black Sea and all the treasures that lay in Asia and the Middle East. Ultimately, Constantinople did fall to the Venetians, not by her own hand, but by the hand she manipulated.
The Venetians are very good at psychological warfare as well. That if you read Friedrich Schiller's Ghost Seer, you can see that what you do is you pretend to be people's friends. You find out what they want, what their weakness is, and you give it to them. If they want money, you give them money. If they want sex, you arrange for that. If they want drugs, you arrange for that. Whatever it is they want, their weaknesses, you feed them. And then you tell them, okay, I'm doing all this for you and I just need these little favors. And you corrupt them. And you corrupt them until you can control them. And of course, you know what they're doing, so you can always blackmail them if they try to get out of line. But basically what controls them is the knowledge that if they don't go along with you, then they lose out on all these things they like. You know, if they play ball with you, then they become rich, they become famous, they have all of their desires sated, they get everything that they want, but in a mental state which is increasingly depraved and subject to manipulation. And that's also the Venetian method, that you win by corruption. And that the thing that the empire fears most of all is an honest man who isn't corruptible because he doesn't want those things.
"15 years after Pope Gregory VII undertook major reforms, establishing ultramontane rule over all kingdoms of Europe, Pope Urban II delivered an infamous sermon at the Council of Clermont, consolidating the rule and issuing the orders to crusade, to retake the Holy Lands from the non-believers. Thousands of men, depraved and deprived of knowledge, were convinced to partake in the satanic expedition, as they were promised full exemption from civil jurisdiction and remission of sins. And so they embarked, thousands of them, mercilessly looting and ravishing all in sight, fearing nothing, for all was forgiven. Although they slayed in Christ's name, as they came closer to victory, the one they served as Lord became ever clearer. After the Norman chivalry conquered Jerusalem, envoys were sent to Venice to report the good news. Venice, in turn, immediately sent their own fleets against the weakened Islamic army to capture the ports of Jaffa and Haifa, vital to her own commercial interests. As they prepared to conquer the cities of Tyre and Ascalon decades later, the Crusaders unhesitatingly gave their offerings to their god. A third of each city was allotted to the oligarchy. And it was ensured that within all the kingdoms of the Crusades, a bakery, a bath, a market, and a free quarter were given to the Venetians. They would be exempt from all taxation, while the Christian king of Jerusalem would pay them a tax of 300 bezants annually. The chivalry, with permission by the papacy, went as far as to proclaim that wherever a Venetian went, their laws should follow them, for no law was higher than Venetian law. The only problem the oligarchy encountered in sponsoring these religious wars was that her strategic privileges within Constantinople were threatened. Alexius I of the Byzantine Empire was against the expedition of the Crusaders because they threatened Byzantium's own territories, so he demanded that Venice withdraw. For the rest of the 12th century, measures were taken against Venice by Constantinople, such as the orders sent forth by the emperor on March 7, 1171, to arrest and imprison every Venetian within Byzantium's domain. This demonstrated to the oligarchy that her mother was no longer going to play her game, which was troublesome, for without access to the Black Sea, it would be difficult for Venice to secure maritime dominance. All the treasure that lay in the lands of India and China were necessary for Venice to complete her puzzle of extended monetarist practice worldwide. But these crafty devils had no need to fear. A plot lay ready for them to seize as soon as the opportunity arose. At the turn of the 12th century, Saracens waged war to retake the Holy Land from the Norman chivalry. The barons of France and Flanders immediately sent 6 messengers to plead to their birth mother, knowing that only with Venice could they defend themselves. They assembled at St. Mark's, where the ambassadors pleaded to the oligarchy.
Sirs, the most exalted and puissant of the barons of France have sent us to you, and they beg your favor, that you may be seized with pity for Jerusalem, which is in bondage to the unbelievers, and that for God's sake you will consent to aid them to avenge the shame of Jesus Christ. And they have chosen you, because they know that no people on the sea has so great power as you, and they bade us to fall at your feet, and not to rise until you grant that you will have pity on the Holy Land beyond the sea.
All six kneeled to the assembly in tears, until Doge Enrico Dandolo delivered the official Venetian reply. Venice assisted the expedition under the condition that they accept a debt of 85,000 marks, the equivalent of 20,000 kilograms of silver. Neither the King of England nor of France generated such an amount annually. As a matter of fact, it would take them nearly 2 years to reach such a sum, and that only if they didn't spend an ounce on anything. Yet, the oligarchy contracted that the debt should be paid within a year. The fools signed Satan's contract, and the result was as Venice expected. The chivalry failed to meet the demands of the contract. The rulers of finance proceeded to utilize their new debt slaves to fulfill the task the empire desired: unchallenged maritime control of the East. Ostensibly, the Venetians only required them to retake their ports in Dalmatia from the Christian kingdom of Hungary. But within a matter of months, Venice's real plot came into effect. By the spring of 1202, 40,000 crusaders, 440 large ships, with 50 galleys were on a direct course towards Constantinople. Upon arrival, as the city walls and gates were broken open, the dogs of war were unleashed, destroying everything, looting from the altars of churches, melting the great statue of Hercules for its bronze, and raping every woman in sight, nuns included. Dandolo and the Venetian fleets kept back, watching their dogs ravish the city. They wanted one thing: the islands and the coasts necessary for their maritime empire, and none amongst the Normans hesitated to grant Venice her desires. Her greatest rival in the Mediterranean was annihilated, and her choices of emperor and patriarch, those who would protect Venetian interests, were appointed. This doge had served the oligarchy well, for Venetian voyages could now continue uninterrupted. With their reassurance of complete maritime dominance, the Venetian oligarchy used their power over the Mediterranean to internationally centralize the control and organization of money within their financial empire. Shortly after the raids in Constantinople, Venice dictated that all exchange of silver and gold bullion could only lawfully occur within her lagoon. Bullion ships sailed twice a year from the imperial center to keep this private market flowing. Through this method, Venice sucked Europe dry of its 500-year-old silver standard and enforced a gold standard upon them. The Venetian gold ducat, minted in 1284 of October 31st, became the lawful currency of international trade. Simultaneously, with the assistance of the Mongolian hordes, Venice forced China and India off their gold standard and forced upon them instead Europe's silver for the wealthy and paper for the poor. Thus, no country could produce bullion for its own use, and all currency exchange had to take place in Venice. During this same interval, the Venetian financial tyranny saw the rise to power of their junior partners in Florence, the family banking houses of the Acciaioli, the Peruzzi, and the House of Bardi, then the largest banking house on the planet. These, among others, were the banks that privatized the revenues of states by providing the usurious loans to most of the kingdoms in Europe and southern Italy. Although they wielded significant power, they were merely practicing the usury and financial speculation which the Venetian-dominated monetary system required. They were loan sharks swimming within a Venetian sea. The floating exchange rate between silver and gold bullion, controlled by the Venetian oligarchy, caused even the gold florian, minted by the Florentine bankers, to devalue to worthlessness. Nevertheless, the Florentine parasites served their master well until they became disposable.
They are lending money to the major houses of Europe, the nations, or what passed for nations at that point, the kingdom, various kingdoms and duchies and things like that. And so they get them into debt. Now, for example, the King of England was in significant debt to the Lombard bankers, which were the Venetian banking system, and in particular to the House of Bardi. And so the king, pledged as collateral the wool production of his kingdom. And then, of course, he's going broke, and so he needs more money, so he borrows more money, and then he pledges all of the sheep as well. The key thing about this kind of debt farming, is that once you incur a debt, the debt never really goes away. Because the interest rates that you have to pay, the money that you have to pay to service this debt, is such that you quit building your country and you start trying to pay your debt. And then you have to borrow more money to pay your debt because you get further behind, and then your interest rates get higher, your debt service becomes more, and you set off on a process that never really ends until everything blows up. But that's the Venetian method of control. And that method has not changed since the days of Venice.
While generating profits of 2/3 on all investments in Europe, the Peruzzi, the House of Bardi, and the others would lure in new debt slaves through the yearly champagne fairs in France, using luxury goods imported from Asia as bait. By the beginning of the 14th century, these Lombard bankers were able to insinuate themselves so far into the administrations of both King Edward II and Edward III of England that they ran the king's personal finances, privatized England's revenues, and then charged England for their services. As part of this business, they convinced foolish Edward III to claim France as part of his kingdom, enticing him to spark the beginnings of the 100 Years' War. Meanwhile, the Peruzzi Bank, through the Franzese bankers, provided the financial services for King Philip IV of France. Thus, through keeping the population in a state of bestiality and manipulating stupid people into wars, the Venetians kept their financial empire on top of the world. But with this practice of monetarism, significant productivity was abandoned, and the body of the state was sucked to the bare bone. The production of wool in England, Flanders, and Spain collapsed. Because of depreciating farmland and equipment, food crises broke out, resulting in repeated famine within the 1310s, 20s, and 30s. The nature of the system caused farmers to go bankrupt, forcing them to hand over their lands to the bankers. For lack of funds and neglect, bridge construction halted, while those built the century before were left to rot. Sanitation was a joke. Monasteries ceased educating the young, and population levels dropped as the system drove further and further towards bankruptcy. The fleas had consumed all the blood of their host. The city of Florence went bankrupt in 1342, and the banking houses of the Acciaioli and the Buonaccorsi followed suit. The Kingdom of France went bankrupt in 1337, and Edward III's England followed suit in 1340. With the fall of these two kingdoms, and Venice playing currencies against each other, the Peruzzi fell bankrupt themselves in 1345, and within the same year, the top bank on the planet, the House of Bardi, finally collapsed. The entire monetary financial system of the 14th century had now entered its phase of complete disintegration. With no legitimate system found to replace the failed one, the conditions were set to pave the way for the great calamity that was about to fall upon Europe. It had already killed 10 million in China, and over the next 2 generations, the combination of plague, social upheavals, and wars wiped out 1/3 to 1/2 of the entire population. In 1508, the League of Cambrai was formed among the significant powers of Western Europe, including Louis XI's heir to the throne and his admirer, Henry VII of England, in an attempt to destroy the monetarist empire still centered in Venice. But with Henry VII's death the following year, and the complicity of the current pope of the time to the Venetians, the League was dissolved. Starting with the Inquisition, and continuing with the promotion of Luther and the Reformation generally, and then supporting the Catholic Church's counter-Reformation, the Venetian Empire had been busy lighting the fuse for religious conflicts throughout Europe. Eventually, among others, they deployed their agent Friar Zorzi to England to manipulate the new king, Henry VIII. They used him to further feed the ongoing frenzy of religious wars by driving him to assume the authority to reform the church in England so he could meet his sexual desires. Fearing the former alliance which sought to destroy the devil, the oligarchy proceeded to move north in search of a new capital from which to operate. They settled throughout northern Europe, opening their first major headquarters in Amsterdam, Holland. Centuries later, they consolidated their true base in 1763, upholding their public political headquarters in London, which remains still today, yet with their satanic souls continuing to reside in Venice. But this shift to the north was not enough. The scientific achievements of Nicholas of Cusa and the Renaissance crippled the era of Aristotle, making his methods worthless to the oligarchy. The creative impulses of the Golden Age caused an explosion of discoveries and innovations which society was not willing to give up. Venice, then the center of the empire, had no choice but to adapt to those conditions, and thus the doctrines of the Venetian Paolo Sarpi came forth, founding what would become modern British liberalism. This new method of the oligarchy allowed innovation, while suppressing creative thinking. It said yes to technology, but no to creativity.
The legacy of this group is the most recent manifestation of an empire whose roots reach back into the monetary and financial usurious methods of the maritime power Venice. Classic Venetian monetary manipulation gained them the debt slaves they needed to take control over international trade and finance, which began heavily in the 13th century. In that period, the Venetian Empire dominated the international bullion market and dictated what currency could be used in China, India, and most of Europe, and later establishing the Venetian gold ducat as the international currency of trade. This is what and how they ran the known world then, the monetarist system. While running the monetarist empire, Venice subverted countries and kingdoms into long wars, such as the 100 Years' War between France and England, through their Wall Street-like banks in Florence, Italy. The effect of this policy of continual wars, not only in Europe, but in Asia, through their control over the operations of the Mongolian barbarians, unleashed a wave of chaos that culminated in the bankruptcies of kingdoms, the Wall Street banks of Florence, and opened the floodgates to hell, otherwise known as the 14th century European Dark Age. Thirsty for genocide and to maintain their imperial position as the world's monetary power, in the late 1500s, the Giovanni New Venetian Party sought to move their maritime base to England and the Netherlands. There, they created the Bank of Amsterdam, the Dutch East India Company, and the British East India Company, with the British East India Company taking over England to eventually create the British Empire. Just like its mother, the British Empire of today is based on controlling the organization of money, giving them complete power to manipulate and speculate on all national currencies at will. This was the same issue that Franklin Roosevelt confronted when he approached Winston Churchill in 1941 and declared the end of this empire. This was the intent of Roosevelt's Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate system of currency among nations, to put an end to the centuries-long control over the money of nations by empire, which implicitly made Roosevelt's domestic Glass-Steagall Act an international agreement. 30 years later, on August 1971, the British annihilated the Bretton Woods system under the presidency of Richard Nixon. In the same year, they created the Inter-Alpha group of banks composed of Credit Bank of Belgium, Nederlandsche Middenstandsbank of the Netherlands, Credit Commercial de France of France, Banco Ambrosiano of Italy, Williams and Glenn's Bank of the United Kingdom, a unit of the Royal Bank of Scotland, and BHF Bank of Germany. It was founded as a mechanism to exploit the vulnerability that now existed among currencies as a result of the takedown of Bretton Woods. The empire's banks represented each of its subject nations of the European Economic Community, an organization established in 1957, which was the seed of today's European Union and its bankrupt monetarist euro currency. Lord Jacob Rothschild was the man who ran the Inter-Alpha Group, initially out of N.M. Rothschild in London. His family's financial power can be traced to none other than Venice, with one of its early sponsors being the Thurn and Taxis family of Bavaria, the controllers of Venetian intelligence and one of the leading families of the Habsburgs' Austrian Empire. Today, Jacob Rothschild, among other crimes, manages the funds of the royal family's Prince Charles. In a 1983 speech, Rothschild made explicit the role that Inter-Alpha was to execute as he bragged.
Two broad types of giant institutions, the Worldwide Financial Service Company and the International Commercial Bank, with a global trading competence, may converge to form the ultimate, all-powerful, many-headed financial conglomerate.
One of the first acts of the Inter-Alpha Group after its 1971 founding was to salvage the old Wall Street Hitler funding machine centered in Brown Brothers Harriman, where Prescott Bush executed the bailout of Hitler's campaign for chancellor. The banks of the Inter-Alpha Group did this by buying a combined 40% interest in Brown, Harriman, and International Banks, a consortium bank founded in 1968 in London by Harriman, London merchant and drug running bank Robert Fleming and Company, and Suez of France. As they say, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. The members of Inter-Alpha did more than just revive the old Nazi funding machine. For example, Fernand Collin, the founding member of Credit Bank, the first members of Inter-Alpha, assisted the Nazis in managing the economy of Belgium during World War II. Also during the war, Ricardo Espirito Santo Silva of Banco Espirito Silva, which joined Inter-Alpha in 1988, hosted the Duke of Windsor after his forced abdication from the British throne due to his sympathizing of Hitler. Ricardo has been identified as a liaison between the Duke and Hitler in the plot to have the Duke regain the throne after the Nazis conquered Britain, a plot which had been aborted. Finally, the two Spanish members of Banco de Bilbao and Banco Santander, a current member of Inter-Alpha, both had ties to the fascist dictator of Spain who controlled the country from 1936 to 1975. Banco Santander was founded by the family of the Rothschild agent in the city of Santander. With the introduction of financial derivatives by Alan Greenspan after the 1987 crash, the Inter-Alpha Group expanded and intensified its financial warfare against sovereign nations. More joined the Anglo-Venetian group throughout the 80s and 90s. Soon, the banks transformed themselves from the mere status of local banks of particular countries into a vast network of global banks as tools of the imperial monetary system. They would come to control 70% of the entire world's banking assets directly or indirectly. And it was them and the empire that deployed it that created the multi-quadrillion-dollar derivatives bubble, the largest financial bubble in history that blew out in 2007, and in which we, the American taxpayer, are being forced to bail out.
The enemy has to be defined properly. Who is the enemy? Well, Cheney is ready for the rubbish bin. He could go quickly. He's earned it. I mean, the Lautenbach report, Lautenbach-Waxman report on the way he's ripped off the American budget, the American till, with his aid of his Halliburton associates, and how he has profited by what Halliburton has done by the way of the steel business, is really puts him in jeopardy. He's not a popular guy. He's hated. Unfortunately, he's also feared, and cowards fear him. But the enemy is not Cheney. Cheney is only a tool, as his wife describes him. The enemy is the Venetian faction. What the problem today in economy, which has to be addressed, and this is where Democrats lose their nerve. In the Senate and elsewhere, they lose their nerve. And it's not that they don't lack inspiring causes to go to, but when they know and they are informed by people like Felix Rohatyn and so forth, that they are treading in dangerous waters, which they might not like to find themselves in, they wince. The biggest of what we have is the defection of Republicans from the Republican cause. Not the Republican Party as such, but from what the neocons represent in the Republican Party. So you have a mass defection of Republicans who cannot support what stinks. But you don't have Democrats, with a few exceptions, who are stepping up to the plate, as it is said, on issues, because they're afraid of what? They're afraid of the financial interests. We have to realize that the enemy of humanity today is the same enemy that Franklin Roosevelt had when he was alive, which sometimes we call the bankers, but he didn't think of the bankers, he had it right. He understood that the financial oligarchy, including the grandfather of the present president, Prescott Bush, had been the authors of funding Hitler's being put into power in Germany. That these people in the American oligarchy, the Wall Street oligarchy, the backers of Coolidge, the controllers of Hoover, these were the people who had put Hitler into power and Mussolini before him and Franco afterward. These were the people who were prepared to support Hitler all the way and his system if he had only gone eastward first against the Soviet Union rather than against France and England. They turned against Hitler. Many of them didn't turn until 1940, but they began to turn against Hitler when it was learned the German military was prepared to strike westward first before striking eastward. So they became anti-Hitler because they didn't like his direction. They liked his methods, but not his direction. And they supported him by bringing fascism, Nazism into power in Germany, and fascism into power throughout continental Europe. Now you understand then, you have to go back to deeper, that fascism, Nazism, which is largely a product of a group known as the Syndicus International. It's a group of bankers in the Venetian tradition. These are independent family banks, family financial interests, which cluster like a slime mold together and have individuality, but they also are a slime. This is the problem. These guys have come to the point where since 1939, when there was no longer, since there was no longer a Soviet Union as a contender, they felt free to destroy Western Europe and the Americas because they no longer needed Western Europe and the Americas as an economic and military strength to control the Soviet Union. Once the Soviet Union was gone, they said, history has ended, as Francis Fukuyama put it. History is now at an end. Now the empire can return. Now, the empire means the Venetian model, which means the British model. It means the Anglo-Dutch liberal model, under which, in their view, the nation state either should not exist, and they intend to eliminate most nation states, which is what the real purpose was in Iraq, not to defeat Saddam Hussein, was to destroy Iraq, which they're doing. Their intent is to destroy Syria. Their intent is to destroy Iran. Their intent is to destroy Israel. The intent is to destroy every part of that region of the world and beyond. And they call them failed states. You know, why does it fail? Because it got killed. That's why it failed. Then what about the other states? Well, they do not want to tolerate in Europe or in the United States a government which does not submit to the power of a financial oligarchy. Now, what these guys are up against is, which Felix Rahat really typifies, is they represent a financier oligarchy which says clusters of these bankers are going to run the world and no government will challenge the authority of these bankers, of their money. That's what the issue is. And they not only use the threat of financial campaigns against politicians and their constituencies, they also kill. They commit murders. They murder officials. They murdered Kennedy. They murdered McKinley. They murdered other people en masse. They are killers. They don't do it personally generally. They give the orders. And they can find Nazi types like the Pinochet types and so forth who will go out and carry out those orders. That's the way it's done. So there is a genuine fear of these bankers or these financier interests among people who know that they hire killers. Most of the assassinations of the world are run, orchestrated by these financial agencies. They kill. They are poisonous cockroaches in our system, inhabiting the pores of our system. And that's what the problem is. People are afraid of them. Again, the answer, as I said just a while ago, the answer is if you don't have a sense of immortality, of an immortal interest in your life, you don't have the source of courage to make the kinds of decisions that challenge power, evil like that. What they represent, what Felix Rohatyn typifies in his own small way, is Satan. You want a figure for Satan? That's him. Not him personally as such, but he typifies what is satanic in society today. This is the evil. And people are afraid to stand up against evil. They say, look, I'm willing to do whatever is possible to reform the society for the better. But look, don't get me in trouble.
la serata inaugurale della 7ª mostra cinematografica a Venezia. Un documentario dell'Istituto Nazionale Luce, Oro Bianco, e la grande realizzazione tedesca sulla vita dello scienziato Roberto Koch erano stati prescelti per questa festa d'arte e di mondanità, aperta con i discorsi del presidente della mostra, Sua Eccellenza il Conte Volpi di Misurata, e del Ministro della Cultura Popolare, Sua Eccellenza Alfieri, alla presenza di un magnifico pubblico e delle autorità, tra le quali ospiti gratitissimi il Ministro della Propaganda del Reich e la signora, e il sottosegretario dottor Dietrich.
Eccellenze, signore e signori, è questa la 7ª volta che Venezia chiama a questa grande prova tutti i produttori del mondo, nessuno eccettuato, perché questa nostra iniziativa abbiamo voluto mettere e vogliamo mantenere sul piede dell'arte e soltanto dell'arte. La cinematografia è giovane e i 6 anni della nostra esperienza hanno potuto già vedere una grande evoluzione. Siamo nati all'indomani della cinematografia muta, abbiamo assistito al trionfo del sonoro, assisteremo al trionfo del colore. Signore, signori, camerati, brevissime parole per porgere alla mia volta il saluto del governo fascista ai rappresentanti delle nazioni qui convenuti, primo fra tutti al mio eminente collega dottor Goebbels, che con la sua presenza qui, e da tutti quanti, scrittori, produttori, registi, artisti, tecnici, esperti, giornalisti, a tutti coloro che alle attività cinematografiche portano il fervore della loro intelligenza e della loro inesauribile passione. Ho l'onore di dichiarare aperta questa 7ª mostra internazionale del cinema.